Welcome back, guys, to the Beyond Condition podcast, where today I'm joined by my mentor, Austin Stout, who's been on the pod a couple of times now. And I've always got very good feedback about our episodes. So super excited for this one. And it's one that I've actually had quite a lot of requests for. And we're going to be talking about menstrual cycle and female sex hormones. So it's going to be a juicy one. So thank you, first of all, for coming on, Austin.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
My pleasure, as always. So I guess we could start with a bit of an overview into what the menstrual cycle actually is, because I think that, it can be maybe overlooked as to what's actually happening in the body during that time.
Yeah, sure. So, kind of a broad overview of what the cycle is. A lot of people may know some of these terms. It's essentially broken down into a few different phases. Technically four phases, I guess, if you want to be really specific. So you have menstruation, right? That's the beginning of the phase. So like if we're looking at what is day one of the cycle, we're talking like that's when the bleed starts, right? And then during this time, the lining of the uterus is shedding because pregnancy hasn't occurred, right? So most of the time, 5 days is considered normal. There's obviously going to be variance in that 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It can vary depending on the person. And most literature will tell you like 3 to 7 is pretty normal. Of course, we know that normal might not always be normal. So there's a little more to that picture, but somewhere in that range. And then you have the follicular phase. So that's going to be the next portion. That's from about that's whatever the menses ends to day 14 ish, right? So about halfway through your cycle. So estrogen will rise. This is causes the lining of the actual uterus to grow and thicken. So this is, like people that have like endometriosis or issues with these tissues. Sometimes during this estrogen rising phase, they'll have issues with pain, right, where the tissue's kind of stimulated. So we have rise in estrogen and also FSH. Okay, so follicle stimulating hormone causing the follicles in the ovaries to grow, and we're basically forming an egg, right? Which is going to be released next, right? So what happens is ovulation. This is roughly day 14. So the ovulation is really short. Okay. So after follicular phase, we'll have a really short ovulation. You have a really high spike in luteinizing hormone, right? So LH causes release of the egg. So, this is where pregnancy can occur, right? Or conceiving. So we have a really short phase in there. It doesn't last very long. That's why there's only a very short window during a month where someone can conceive, and people would do things like, ovulation tests and things of that nature. So next we have luteal phase, which is pretty much everything after that till the end of the cycle. The egg leaves the ovary, begins to travel through the fallopian tubes to the uterus, and progesterone is rising. So it's basically preparing the uterine lining for pregnancy. That's assuming that during ovulation that happened, right? The sperm would be fertilized, or like it attaches itself. So like implantation would be kind of the word. And then they person would become pregnant. So if there is no pregnancy, then progesterone, or then the hormone levels are going to drop back down, and then the lining is going to shed. So there's like, okay, well, nothing happened, right? So we'll shed this lining, and we're back to square one, and then the cycle repeats. So that's what a menstrual cycle is.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's one of those things, isn't it? It just happens as a female, and then you just know that every month it's gonna. But then, of course, there's so many cases of irregular periods, not bleeding, different contraception that's used, and so many other factors that come into play with the menstrual cycle in general.
Yeah, for sure. So like you and I had talked, kind of tailoring this a little bit more to our population. I think the issues that we run into are probably losing menstrual cycles, right? Or not having periods. I mean, I would say amenorrhea is a term that we would use, right?
Yeah.
So amenorrhea is probably the most common of these issues. Of course, we do have women that have other fertility issues or reproductive issues, PCOS or endometriosis, or they have, these varying degrees of problems, and maybe they had them before they started fitness, but a lot of the time it's really the stress of the training and the diet that are inducing the problem,
Mm,
right? So like, why would we have the problems, I guess, is the question that we would want to ask. And a lot of it is because progesterone notoriously drops quick. So like, if anyone's seen any labs, if you see any labs in females, you start to see this trend where we're having chronically low progesterone in so many women, so they're not actually able to have this cycle. Um, so in the U.S., the units are a little bit different, their measurements are a little different, but we're seeing, I'm seeing like basically progesterone that's almost not registering on there. It's like zero point 0.1, zero point 0.1, 0.2. So very, very low. And so these people aren't having periods at all,
mm,
right? And then we kind of compound this issue with the fact that estrogen is high in a lot of people, right? So now we have this huge gap when we have something called estrogen dominance, right? So estrogen dominance technically it's the ratio of estrogen to progesterone, right? Like there's supposed to be a ratio. Now that could be in a couple different forms, right? Like if you have normal estrogen and low progesterone, you would technically still be estrogen dominant. However, a lot of the folks that we're running into are kind of in a really bad situation because a lot of them actually have low progesterone and high estrogen, so they really have a big gap in these, and we're running into these issues because of things like GI issues, just slow motilities, like slow detoxification from the liver. So like estrogen is not being excreted from the body very efficiently, or it's being recirculated back into the body a
mm,
lot,
mm.
right? And then we have some other issues like inflammation, like the histamine class. So we're going to go over that too, you and I. So we'll have one of the things that actually happens there is when we have these like inflammatory immune responses with histamine, it'll actually like tell the ovaries to produce more estrogen. So not only can we have poor detox, recirculation, but also overproduction at the same time. So now we have people that have no progesterone and they're just estrogen factories,
Mm.
right? So those are the kinds of situations we're running into. Why is that? Because we have, chronic stress, chronic inflammation, chronic GI issues, and we're just kind of like stacking these issues on top of each other.
Yeah, because when you start delving into, we actually spoke about this on our mentorship call the other day, about when you start looking at someone's history and going through your initial questionnaires and things when you take a client on board, and it can be quite vague, and then you start to get to know the client and you delve a bit more, and things like you mentioned stress levels, and then you combine that with bad sleep and things that they maybe don't realize are as bad as they are until they get a coach and you start asking these questions.
Yeah, you're right. And it's no fault of anyone. I think that people just don't know, right? The client, there's a lot of education now. There's a lot of people talking about this stuff, but I think the problem is that we it's not like it was before, but we still kind of normalize, people were really normalizing just beating yourself to death,
Yeah, yeah,
right? In every way, shape, and form. Like this is what's going to get you ahead. And in reality, your results start to regress.
yeah,
If we're talking purely from a body composition standpoint, which is what most people are after ultimately, right? Whether they're a competitor or not, they have a body composition goal probably. So, you know, at a point when the body is systemically stressed and we do have all these issues going on and losing menstrual cycles and all this stuff, eventually that, the point of diminishing returns where doing more is obviously causing more harm than good. And unfortunately, what happens is by the time by the time they come to someone that can help them, they're really in a deep hole already. So it's not like it's not a case where I'm just going to come in. Very rarely can I just say, all right, well, we're going to take a couple supplements and, you know, rest for a few days, like we're good to go.
Mm.
You know, this is years and sometimes decades of abusing their body, and they've created this like cumulative hole that they're in.
Yeah. And it's those questions we ask as coaches that I think sometimes it's almost like the client can feel like, why are you asking me these questions? And sometimes they're quite, questions that are a bit, oh, I don't want, people feel a bit cagey, I guess, or like, why are you asking me this? And it is purely because so much of these things that we're talking about today, it has such an impact on the physique. It's crazy when even stress alone, when you start managing stress, it's, as you know, a night and day difference as to how the physique can respond. It's mental.
Yeah, I mean, a great example would be let's look at let's look at contest prep. What do we do at the end stages of contest prep? What is the last week contest prep, right? You feed up,
Yeah.
right? Some way, you reduce cardio, you reduce training load somehow, right? Like this is going to be variance person to person and case to case, but we're doing all of these things. And why? Because we're trying to peak the physique. What does a peak physique entail? Low stress environment,
Yeah.
right? Like, why is the physique getting better and shedding water and inflammation and looking tighter as the week goes on? It's not just because you put carbs in. I mean, that's part of it. But the other part is a lot of it is like we could increase food minimally. And if we just got the stress rinsed off the body, we're going to have a dramatic effect on people, right? Why do refeeds work? Well, the literature shows us that if a long enough refeed will probably have a little bit of impact on leptin and BMR, but we're not talking anything profound,
Mm.
right? A lot of the benefit is cortisol is dropping, stress is dropping, inflammation's dropping. People enjoy the food, right? Dopamine goes up, you know. So
Yeah.
right. So all those things are leading to a lower stress environment. Same thing with same thing with trying to fix one of these cases. What are we doing? Well, of course it's going to vary, but generally I would say that the vast majority of cases, especially in the female realm, are under eating, overtraining, and if they're not overtraining, they're overstressed. And when I say overtraining, I don't mean overtraining in the sense that someone else might be able to handle that volume if they were functioning well, and you might also be able to handle it. But the fact of the matter is, most of your recovery ability is allocated towards everything else, right? Poor sleep, poor habits. I mean, and honestly, usually stress really is derived from those little things that people don't really account for. It's just that a great example would be like I'll do a meet someone in person, okay? That was a client, and I'm like, all right, you are making me anxious standing around you,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's a problem. You know,
For
like
sure.
that is a problem. I have had and we're not meeting every person face to face. That's not because we're online, but you know, I've had people that I've talked to them and move in and I'm like, whoa. I'm like, no wonder. I'm like, no wonder no wonder we have problems. I mean, that's our problem, right? So this we're dealing with the huge psychological component, obviously.
Yeah, yeah, and you know what it's like in a prep, especially a lot of first timers listen to the podcast, and you have these internal stresses about even competing in itself. So the countdown's on, you're in a prep, you've got a date in mind and what have you, and these external pressures, internal pressures all amount, and it's our job as coaches at times to just go, let's just try and quiet the mind here and be able to focus on the prep and do your best. I always say to people, all you can do is your best and what's in your capabilities. But like you touched on there about deloads and refeeds and things, sometimes it's a case of almost convincing clients to say, look, we need to take your foot off the gas because you're showing so many signs of being over dieted, or training is starting to lag and things like this. And it is sometimes hard to facilitate
Mhm.
that trust because they're like, no, I need to train.
I'll tell you what, probably one of the skill set, probably the biggest skill set that I have tried to develop in the past few years that I've really tried to like pay attention to and get better at was stress management in with prep clients and with fat loss clients in general. So like when you're newer, when you're newer in coaching or newer in competing, I think that having things like set refeeds and set deloads and like all this stuff is helpful because it forces you to do it,
Yeah.
right? But when you become more advanced and awareness goes up, assuming that your awareness isn't driving you nuts,
Yeah.
right? But as a coach, for me, I've been able to go against that a lot in those prep situations, especially or fat loss situations, and feel very comfortable saying, take 2 days out of the gym, don't do anything, but refeed, eat more, like whatever, right? All this number of things, and and there it works, right? If you know, right? So I tell people and I tell coaches that I'm working with, like, hey, success in prep is two things. You got to push really hard to get lean. Most people, not everyone, but most people have to dig pretty hard to get lean. But on the flip side of that, you also have to know how to mitigate stress the best you possibly can and know when to hit the brakes,
Mhm.
right? So don't be afraid to push, but also you have to know when to hit the brakes. I mean, you can't, it's not a one-sided equation, right?
Yeah, I feel like there's almost an intuition as well as coaches, and that's why it is very helpful to work with someone for a long period of time. If you can do several shows with
Absolutely.
someone, of course, you start to learn their body, and it's funny, isn't it, that intuition thing? Because you just you know, and it's like, right, we need
Yeah.
to do, like you say, put 2 days in and more food or whatever, and it's building that trust, like I say earlier, for the client to go, look, I'm just gonna give you the reins. And luckily all of my clients do that. But in the past, it's been, it's giving that education, of course, and them trusting you.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I was actually looking at my schedule for this year. We're in June already. Today is June
I
1st,
know.
which is crazy.
Yeah.
So lots like people prepping and stuff.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm looking at my roster of people that are prepping, and I think I would have to go back and look, but I think every single one of my clients this year is prepping for either an IFBB Pro show or a national show, which is a pro qualifier. Every one of them.
Yeah, it's big.
But 90% of them have been my clients for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, even some of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So, and like I'm prepping these people, and it's such a cool process because I'm so in tune with them.
Yeah.
Right. Like, of course, things happen, life happens, stuff, there's obstacles, there's unforeseen things that's how it will always be. But um, it's clear down to like the communication with a client like that is so efficient. Like they know exactly what to tell you, they know when to tell it to you. They don't undershare, but they don't overshare.
Yeah.
Right. Um, they aren't they know when to worry about things, they know when not to worry about things, like so from a stress management standpoint, they're so successful because we are very in tune and they trust me a lot, you
Mm,
know.
mm. Yeah.
So we veered off a little bit, but
Oh yeah, I think it is definitely very, very helpful for people to hear. And I do have a lot of conversations about this with clients and also the podcast listeners, because stress management in a prep is massive, and it's underrated at times a lot. And I think as well that does fall back on, the coach in itself, the coaching, and how the coach resonates with the client. And of course, we've both got experience in competing ourselves, so we can relate a lot to our clients when they are maybe potentially, up against the stresses of what comes from a prep internally as well as, physically.
yeah, for sure. Did you want to touch on like actual strategies
Yeah,
for
I think it'd be quite cool to, I mean, bodybuilding in itself and physique development, whichever phase you're in, how the menstrual cycle, maybe how you can look at nutrition, training considerations, supplementation around that time would be quite helpful.
yeah. So we'll make a few things clear. I think that if we're talking extremes, so we're talking getting in contest shape,
Yeah.
outside of maybe bikini, but even then it's a stretch. Losing a menstrual cycle in the later stages is pretty normal.
Yeah.
So like if you're competing without any exogenous hormones, no PEDs, anything like that,
Mm.
the amount of people that are going to be able to, even starting at a really healthy, like a really good starting point, the amount of people that are going to maintain it all the way through is going to be pretty low, right? So, and of course, if you're introducing exogenous hormones, then of course that's probably going to shut down some of your endogenous hormone production. So of course you might lose your cycle. But um, outside of that case, I think there's a few things if we're talking prep that are going to be super important. One, don't start prep with one foot already out the door, right? Like if you don't have a cycle already or you're having issues already, like don't start prep. So I mean, for a few reasons, of course, that issue is going to get exponentially worse much quicker, but also like cosmetically, you're not going to get the best results,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
And we see this over and over again. Like people get in good shape for for the first show, and the second show is a little bit harder than the third prep. They're like, all right, this is not working
Yeah, yeah,
anymore. You know what
yeah.
I mean? I'm pushing 3 times as hard, but getting one half of the results,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
And then next thing you know, like nothing's happening,
Mhm. Mhm.
So that's where like making sure that you are starting in a good place is important. So if you are working with a coach, give the coach time. Don't be like, hey, I'm competing in 16 weeks. I don't have any data for you. I haven't had blood work and I really don't, my routine is not good. Like, okay, well,
Yeah.
maybe it'll work, but who really knows? So if we're talking like from a planning and structure standpoint, having enough time, making sure you're checking all those boxes, making sure that you are having a cycle, so on and so forth before you start. So that's important. That's number one. Number two would be probably understanding what medications or supplementation is going to do, like from a being realistic with that. I kind of mentioned that too. So if you are competing enhanced, you know and taking PEDs, do you understand that what those are going to do to your menstrual cycle potentially, and how that reflects? So like I said, you're probably, depending on the dose and duration and everything else going on, if you lose your cycle, it's pretty typical, right? So just from the fact that you're taking an exogenous hormone, so the body probably will create less endogenous hormone.
Mm.
Same thing with the male taking testosterone, right? He'll notice that his his actual testosterone levels endogenously are going to drop,
Mm.
right? So, second would be like birth control is a big factor here. So, man, I mean, hormonal birth control is a huge topic in and of itself. A lot of women, unfortunately, are prescribed birth control for a lot of reasons other than pregnancy protection.
Yeah,
So,
for sure.
like, if I don't know what the exact statistics are, I'm sure it probably varies, place to place. But I would venture to say if we looked at it, we would find a very large number of women prescribed birth control, hormonal birth control for things like acne, irregular menstrual cycles, heavy menstrual cycles, painful menstrual cycles, endometriosis, like all these things. So rather than managing the root cause of the disease or issue, they're given this medication that's essentially kind of stopping their own menstrual cycle,
Mm.
right? Um, Now the problem with that is, like, over time, your your own endogenous hormone production being altered for such a long period of time. So if you want to come off birth control, people will have issues coming off and restoring their hormones, have issues with fertility if that's something they're interested in. And like I said, they're really not addressing the root cause. So like, for example, a teenager, a lot of people that are put on for those reasons are put on young, right? They're usually put on pretty young. Um, there's a lot of things that are going on at that time. One, I don't personally know a lot of teenagers that have good diets. Not
Yeah.
many. Not that I've been in touch with. There are very few, right? So that's one thing. So of course, these highly inflammatory processed food diets, it's not surprised that you're getting acne when you're adding it on top of being in puberty heavily,
Hormones. Yeah, yeah.
right? So routine. Any chance they get, teenagers going to stay up all night. Like of course, yeah, of course their body's resilient. It's not the same as a 50-year-old body, but at the same time, when we start adding all these stressors in there in this erratic hormone environment, of course there's going to be irregularities in menstrual cycle and acne and things like that.
Yeah.
Seems obvious, you
Yeah,
know?
but you wouldn't think it, would you? Like you wouldn't actually think about it as a teenager or maybe as a parent.
Yeah, but you just want a solution to the problem, so they give them birth control. And then there are different types. So talk about that just a little bit so people understand. We really a few types. So if we're talking hormonal birth control, we have generally like IUDs, longer term birth control. Some people even like NuvaRing, which is a ring insert. That's not the same as an IUD or a pill. So IUDs are like your popular ones, like Mirena in the U.S. is the name brand, or Skylena. Essentially, what these are like mostly progestin based birth controls. So they're not progesterone, they're a progestin, it's a synthetic progestin. And then we have pill forms, which are normally, not always, but normally a combination of an estrogen and progesterone, both in a pill.
Mm.
Now, most of the newer pills, the newer generations of pills are very low dose. So they dose them as low as they can while still being effective, obviously. Most of the IUDs, or even heaven forbid, like someone's still using like a shot, a Depo-Provera shot or something, they're very long acting. They stay in the system a long time. When you stop using them, they wreak a lot of havoc. It seems that IUDs generally tend to be more problematic. It depends on the person and their hormone profile, but IUDs tend to be a little bit more problematic. They tend to cause more, even like androgen symptoms in a lot of these people. They stick around a long time when you take them out because the body has to metabolize and get rid of all this hormone. Pill still going to probably cause some problems, but maybe not to the same degree. It's just that a lot of the time people start these things for those issues, and it does help initially. They're like, wow, I'm not having these erratic cycles, because it stops their cycle a lot of the time, right? Or I'm not having this acne or whatever. And that's great. They got relief, but they also did not, correct anything long term.
Yeah.
So over the course of time, as this like alters your own endogenous hormone profile, it's also potentially doing things like, causing gut issues by slowing down motility in the GI tract, um, causing potentially issues in things like neurochemistry. So like neurochemical profile, because a lot of like serotonin, for example, is produced in the gut. So causing like erratic, things. So a lot of the time I will see this in more severe cases where they have been on a birth control for a long time, and then they come up with these mood disorders, and now they're on an SSRI also, right? A serotonin drug, so like Zoloft or something like that, right? There's a bunch of them. But so these connections start to pop up. So if we relate this to bodybuilding, and we're adding all of these additional stressors on top of that,
Yeah.
oof, I mean, I think it's funny that bodybuilders, just because I would say this, I would say generally bodybuilders now, especially, are more cognizant of things like getting sleep. They're
Yeah.
not always good at it, but like getting sleep and obviously diet. But you can't just take those two things and think it bulletproofs you to all this other stress. You still have career, family, all this other stuff that normal people have, and you're beating the hell out of yourself at the same time. Like, I don't know what makes people think that they all of a sudden have like some superhuman nervous system, that they are indestructible,
Yeah.
right?
Or like, people go, I don't know why I'm so tired. And you think you're, close to a show. and you're doing all of this stuff alongside your
Yeah.
career, etc. And it's like, we're not superhuman. And I think as well, from a coaching standpoint, having that conversation before someone enters a prep as to what it involves is a big conversation to have. And you've got to give almost like I try and lay it on pretty thick as to what a prep involves, but I think that people think, well, I could just do a prep and jump on stage. That's a good idea. It seems pretty cool. But actually, as well, the health implications to a prep, you don't maybe get told about that before you go into a prep, of course.
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking hormones, there was a great case study. There was a great study, man, this probably would have been 5, 6, 7 years ago. I'm not exactly sure. But it was done in the US, I believe, with a group. And I know one of the guys, I actually do one of the guys' training program. He has a PhD, and I'm not sure what exactly, but some smart guys, right? So they did a study taking natural male bodybuilders. These weren't even women, right? We know men are probably a little more resilient than women. They took natural pro male bodybuilders, natural bodybuilders, and at least in the US, they get in really good condition, right? You really, really lean. So what they did is they tested a lot of parameters, typical stuff, testosterone, cortisol, but they even tested more in depth like leptin levels and ghrelin levels, so like hunger hormones, and a bunch of other parameters. And they were like, well, how long after a prep does it take for these things to normalize? And keep in mind, these are experienced people. So I would venture to say that they were probably pretty diligent about doing things right
Yes.
afterwards.
Big
Most
point.
people dick around for the first 3 months and you haven't really recovered anything,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So we're saying like best case scenario, they're doing stuff right.
Yeah.
They were showing something along the lines of 6 months, cover all of the markers that they were testing for in a male, not a female, and someone that's doing things probably pretty well, pretty efficiently.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if that gives you any indication of what it would be like to recover as a female, you know, so if you're doing shows every year, you're you're not doing shows once a year, you're actually prepping for for a third of the year
Mm.
every year. So
Yeah, I mean, I
that's
did it myself for 10 years. And when I look back, I think, blimey, when I tell people, they're like, what? How did you do that? And I got into that serial every single year. Like I did 6 or 7 seasons over 10 years. And I actually didn't have a period myself for 6 of those years. And I was still going back to stage and whatever. And, now I know better and I'm having a longer off season. But it is when you actually look at it properly. My last season in 2022, it was about 6 months. And then I was like, oh, I feel like I'm maybe normalizing now and training is much better. But until then, it was like training was getting a little bit better, a little bit better. And I think that we expect, like we spoke about earlier, that it's sort of superhuman and you can just keep going. But for me, I was addicted to getting lean, I guess, per se, and in a bad spot. But it is crazy. If you're trying to improve as an athlete, which is what I've learned, you're going to need to spend time in that off-season phase.
yeah, you pointed out a couple important things there. One is that most people don't really know what they're supposed to feel like,
Yeah.
because it's very subjective. It's kind of like, well, if you felt shitty for 6 years, I mean, what's the difference?
Yeah, I always say I had this like emotional attachment to feeling like shit.
And right. Oh yeah, a lot of people do. It's the worse you feel, the more progress you make, at least in your mind, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So I get that 100%. And the second thing is, of course, these people outside of maybe the first couple years or so where they're newer,
Mm.
they tend to not make progress after a while,
Yeah.
right? Because you can at the beginning, you can probably do it and you can probably still make progress because you'll rebound out of the show a little bit and you're newer and you're kind of in that phase. But as you become more advanced, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So, when we see that, we're not making progress. We um, don't feel don't feel good at all ever. We feel a little bit better, and then we go back to feeling terrible again, right? Normally what puts the nail in the coffin for most people, I think, is that they come up with some issue that prevents them from pushing through anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's the fact that they literally just can't do it. They can't they can't eat. Maybe their digestion is so bad that they just can't, you know, get through the food that they need.
Mm.
Um, maybe their fatigue is so bad that they just can't perform the tasks that they need to do. There's always it's basically rock bottom. Like people have to hit their own personal rock bottom, whatever that is,
Yeah.
to normally see that there's a problem.
Yeah. And of course it's totally not normal to not have a period for that long, but I was just in this mindset. And then now, like the first time I got my period back, I like ran down the stairs. I was so excited to have a period, and then I thought, oh no, it's really inconvenient. But now actually, I don't know if this is common, but since my first exposure to Primo, so 6 week exposure, my periods have got a lot more heavy and I experience a lot more pain. I've done 2 exposures now, and I've spoken to my coach Tom about it, and we're going to look at a different compound for my next exposure. But is that something that you've come across?
Um, I would say yeah, pretty
Mm,
typical
mm. Yeah,
for the
yeah,
most part. Um, you know, another thing too is like we had talked about the impact of PEDs on hormones and on cycles. So there's there's some things there that are probably important to point out. And like what I've been using males as an example because I think people know these examples better. But let's say that a guy does a couple cycles. What generally happens to men? Well, they generally end up on replacement,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Same thing for women. Like women can't expect to keep cycling on and off, you know, in this perpetual loop over short periods of time and not have exogenous or endogenous slowdown, right? So with that being said, I mean, from a hormone standpoint, like be prepared to make that commitment. And of course, over time, your hormones are going to drop anyhow with age. It's just we're kind of like expediting that
yeah.
process.
We're fighting
Of,
the aging
we're
process.
speeding, we're speeding up the hormone decline process, and you're just going to end up there a little bit sooner. But you know, it is part of it, right? So I mean, that's stuff that is important to understand and maybe talk to your coaches about. People are, you know, it's of course like awareness is heightening some, but you know, there's still a lot of people that are hey, I'll take some Anavar or take some this and that because their friends taking it. I'm like, well, do you know what it is? Do you know what it does? No.
I want to get and no, this is like a massive driver for me for the podcast. I've had Joe on a few times and other guests, and it's getting a bit of education out there because especially in the female realm, I mean, I hear a lot of horror stories where clients go to their coach and ask about, oh, why am I going to take this compound? And the coach says, oh, just take it. And it's like, I think you should probably maybe get some other advice or look at other coaching because if someone's asking you to take something and they don't have a reason why, for me, that would be a red flag.
Right. Or understand like why you would take certain things in combination with each other or
Yeah.
etc. Stuff like that. I mean, there's I mean, man, I see this type of thing every day. It's not just, it's not just doctors putting women on birth control. It's also just as much coaches putting people on PDs and not knowing what they're
Yeah.
what they're doing, you
Yeah,
know.
it's mental. Like some of the stories I hear, I just think, well, I don't know how the coaches sleep at night, but money, whatever. But
Well, I'll say this, not to interrupt you. I'll say this. A lot of them probably sleep at night because they don't know any better.
yeah, yeah, good point.
I think some of them do know better and they probably just are cashing in, but I think there's probably a lot of them that really just don't.
Mm, mm. Yeah. I mean, I always say if you're the client, ask the question. If you don't get the answer, then it's up to you, what you do, whether you look at getting help from someone else or whatever. But definitely in the realm of PDs, hence why Matt and I are doing the mentorship with you, it's our due diligence to know as much as we can to help our clients, especially if they're going down the assisted route, because you should be able to ask that question. And if something, with my cycle as that example, when I spoke to Tom about it, He gave me as much information as he could, and then we're going to look at different options so that trust is there, because I'm experiencing a problem, the heavy periods, the pain, it is bad, and we're going to look at different options.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And you don't expect everyone to know everything, but
No.
you can figure it out, find the answer somewhere, right?
Or
You know,
ask someone else.
like, all right, somebody's gonna have the answer.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And when it comes to, so training is something that I've personally had to start amending a little bit during my cycle. And we sort of program in for that time to lower the intensity, lower the volume, etc. I know it's going to be person dependent, but is there sort of guidelines that you would personally use, or is it different per case in regards to training?
So there's actually there is a little bit of, I don't know if you want to call it research. There's some literature on this topic kind of showing us that our recovery ability, maybe strength, maybe some of these performance metrics do kind of go down during certain times of your menstrual cycle. So what I generally tell people is if you don't have that much of a drop off, so like during different phases of the cycle and you don't, other than maybe some minor PMS symptoms, if you don't feel like everything's dropping off, then don't change anything.
Yeah.
Proceed,
Yeah.
proceed as you normally would. Now, for some people, there is going to be a pretty noticeable drop off in performance, around period time, for example. That might warrant us, for a lot of people, it's simple. Maybe it's just kind of back the intensity off a little bit, maybe back the volume off a little bit. Um, I just find that they're, if anything, like general kind of endurance and performance as later in the workouts or at the end of sets starts to drop off. They kind of fall off a little bit quicker,
Yeah.
right? So I think a good rule of thumb would be, because a lot of time they're a little more tired, a little more stressed, would be first and foremost probably drop the intensity down slightly. Now, if they're doing really high volume training, you also might want to drop the volume slightly as well.
Mhm.
But yeah, definitely can do those things. Those are great tools if needed. It's not necessary for everyone though.
Yeah. And nutrition wise, I'd actually be interested to ask you about, is there, I don't know, is there I don't know what the right word is, a need to potentially bring the food up a little bit during a heavy cycle, or would you remain the same? Again, person dependent.
Um, so I will say this. I will say personally, I don't I don't change it that much. However, there is some evidence that might suggest, like during the follicular phase, for example, that that glucose, the body's a little more, glucose driven. But my problem with it is if we go into these phases where the body's maybe preferencing like carbohydrate, for example, and you're craving, and we start giving the person more of it, we
Yeah.
might also open ourselves up to binging
Yeah. And this,
also.
yeah.
So there's something to be said about potentially just like keeping that environment pretty stable, you know?
Yeah.
If we absolutely have to, we can adjust a little bit, but I would try to avoid doing any drastic, like, okay, I'm going to flip the macros 180 degrees. We're going to go, all carbs and drop the fats are down. Like I wouldn't, right. I would not suggest that. The person's probably just going to end up binging.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, when I work with people, if they do suffer with, you mentioned their cravings, which is obviously quite a big thing that's linked with the menstrual cycle, I try and ask them, what those cravings are for, and then look at them, what is it, more sweet stuff, which it generally is, like you say, glucose. Can we look at things that are going to be maybe a similar taste that are within the macro guidelines that you've given them, or is there ways that we can, get around it rather than
For
add
sure.
more food?
Yeah. Yeah. Reasonably like change some stuff up, maybe a little bit of this, a little bit of that, if they can allot something into their macros. But and you're gonna know the client. Like
Yeah.
if you've worked with them for any amount of time, you're gonna kind of have a level of like, all right, well, it's probably safe to do it with this person.
Yeah.
maybe not with this person,
It's a thing. And with when you get cravings, and I mean, I try and work with people again on mindset around this, right? Like I ask questions and I try and understand, you know, what's facilitating that craving, whether it's something they're just leaning on it being this time of the month and I should want chocolate or I should want, and is it maybe an issue with the actual overall diet and they're not feeding themselves throughout the day, etc. Is there, would you say there's more consideration to cravings that would be worth speaking about today?
Well, I think you made a good point there. I think that if there's some kind of deprivation during other points during the day, that could be problematic. So, if like, oh, I'm craving everything at night, I'm saving all my food till night. Well, what if we actually maintained stable, caloric intake during the day and didn't create these cravings at night, you know? Um, Especially for like macro dieters where like, oh, I crave a lot during my menstrual cycle. So I'm going to save all my calories for nighttime.
10
Like,
p.m.
well, if you didn't save all your calories for nighttime, you probably wouldn't crave as much at night.
Yeah.
So those are things to consider. Again, like I kind of alluded to that already, is stability in the environment is important.
Mm. And if someone is, obviously, like we touched on right at the start, we're online coaches, so we're not in person per se. If someone keeps falling back to this type of behavior, have you had any clients that have sort of done this type of stuff around saying that it's time of the month and I'm craving this and this is why I've done it? Is there certain things that you do put in play as an online coach?
I will be honest, I don't think I deal with a lot of people that are just straight up deviating from the plan heavily and like, all right, I crave chocolate, so I ate,
Yeah.
4 chocolate bars.
Yeah.
I don't really deal with that a lot. But what I would say is if they have that tendency, especially if they're maybe a Gen Pop client or something, I would recognize that, and rather than start punishing them, I would definitely be like, okay, well, can we implement certain foods into the diet during the time, like you said,
Mm.
at those time of month to help mitigate that? Do we need to spread the macros, around evenly? Like, what times a day are you craving? Is it when you're stressed out? Like, what is going on? Um, the solution generally lies in the problem, right? Generally, they're going to tell us where we need to fix it,
Yeah. And we use our intuition that we spoke about earlier.
right? Yeah, yeah.
And probably just before we wrap up, is there any supplementation guidelines, things like iron and that type of stuff that would be worth covering as well for when people are on their cycle?
Yeah, you do lose iron, so you're going to lose some iron via red blood cells during that time. Dietary wise, though, I mean, if you we eat a lot of iron in the diet if you're eating animal proteins. Maybe you could, if you have had issues with anemia or iron deficiency, you could certainly consider adding some more red meat into the diet or even supplementing with it. Um, but a lot of the time, we can kind of cover those needs via, via diet. Uh, but I would say from a hormone standpoint overall, the issue is probably that a lot of people they're having issues because they have undereaten for a long time. So the chance that they have nutrient deficiencies is pretty high, right? So like we can see certain things pop up on blood work, like on the CBC and stuff. So we've talked about MCV and RDW and like all these numbers. So like there are things there, but I think the problem is that there's probably goes a little deeper than we can see. So if we are questioning this in terms of we do get this client that has irregular periods or no period or something like this, and a lot of this is under eating induced, it may be wise to just support them with an overall multivitamin initially, at least until things start to regulate. Something that's of high quality, that has high bioavailability in the ingredients. Most of your typical brands, and you guys are in the UK, but things like Life Extension makes a good basically 2 per day that has good forms of the vitamins. So most brands like that are going to provide that, making sure that, I know a lot of people use like Chronometer, for example, making sure that there's no gaps and nutrient deficiencies there. That's also a good idea. Um, but you shouldn't be creating a whole bunch of nutrient deficiencies around your cycle if you're as long as you're pretty solid the rest of the month, because you do store even water soluble vitamins, like you store some of those,
Mhm.
right? So like you should have an abundance of those things available, that it's not like 5 days of a period is gonna, you know,
Wipe it.
put you right. It's not gonna wipe everything out.
Mm. I
Right.
think it's so relevant actually to finish on this point, because I sometimes feel like as coaches, because what we're learning with you even more so, but really leaning on good nutrition as a base level in whatever phase you're in. I think sometimes people get fed up with, even just trying to incorporate a mixture of veggies and fruits. It's like, why have I got to keep having all of these foods? And it's like, you can get such good benefits from just having that baseline good diet and variety across your day. But yeah,
Well,
it's
yeah, and it builds resilience. I mean, like I'll close it with this: stress resilience. If you aren't stressed most of the time and you do pretty good, you're going to be fine if you have a stressful day and a stressful week even. The problem is we just can't do it all the time. Our body is amazingly designed to compensate for stress, to compensate for nutrient deficiencies, to compensate for literally everything. So if you've given it a good foundation most of the time, those bad days or that period it's not gonna hurt anything, you know.
yeah, for sure.
But got to build the base.
Yeah, build the foundations first. Just keep that baseline
Yep.
in. So if you've taken anything from today, make sure you eat your broccoli every single day and be
Yep.
period.
There you go.
Thank you,
You're good to
Austin.
go.
I appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you later.
Bye bye.